The screen door had a particular way of closing that summer, a sound that became the acoustic signature of the season. It would bang shut, then settle with a soft click of the latch, and in that click was the entire rhythm of those 3 months before ninth grade. The sound meant freedom. The sound meant heat. The sound meant a kind of time that was different from school time, slower in some ways and faster in others, a time that seemed infinite while it was happening and then looking back seemed impossibly brief. I was 13 that summer, which meant I was at an age where I could go places without an adult, but was not yet old enough to drive, not yet old enough to work a real job, not yet old enough to be considered a young adult. The summer was a kind of threshold, though I did not think of it that way at the time. I simply lived it day by day without understanding that something was shifting underneath the surface of ordinary activities. The heat that summer was particular, not just hot, but humid in a way that made the air feel thick, made it feel like you were moving through something solid. Everyone moved more slowly. Everyone talked about the heat as if it were a separate entity, something that had to be managed and negotiated. The ice cream truck came through the neighborhood in the afternoon, and the sound of its music was the signal for children to look for change. Grandmother kept pitchers of lemonade in the refrigerator, the kind made from scratch with real lemons, and the condensation on the outside of the pitcher would run down onto the kitchen table. My younger cousin came to stay with us that summer. His name was Michael, and he was a year younger than me. Still in middle school, still young enough that the summer felt different to him than it felt to me. He was excited about everything in the way that younger children can be. He wanted to ride his bike everywhere, wanted to play basketball at the court near the school, wanted to stay outside until someone called him in. I was supposed to look out for him, and I did. Mostly, though, I also wanted to do other things, wanted to be with my friends, wanted to be free from the responsibility of supervision. Michael and I had a history that had nothing to do with actual time and everything to do with closeness. We had spent summers together for years, and we had settled into a rhythm with each other that required no explanation or renegotiation. We knew what the other would do, what the other wanted, what the other was thinking most of the time. But that summer felt different. That summer, I was aware in a new way of the gap between us. He was still a child. I was becoming something else, though. I could not have named what. The neighborhood that summer was in transition in ways that I did not fully understand. Some families were moving away. The older houses were being sold, sometimes to people from outside the neighborhood, sometimes left empty to slowly decay. There was talk among the adults about the neighborhood changing, about property taxes going up, about what was coming. But the children did not quite grasp the implications. For us, it was still our neighborhood, still the place where we knew every corner, every alley, every shortcut. The trees were still the trees we had climbed. The streets were still safe in a way that we had never questioned. What I see now is that I was living through a displacement that I did not know was a displacement. The neighborhood was being remade. Families were being pushed out or leaving voluntarily because they sensed that the place was changing. But from inside of it, from the perspective of a child, it seemed like we would always be here. It seemed like the relationships we had built, the routines we had established, the patterns of life in this place would continue indefinitely. There was a man named Mr. Peterson who lived in a house at the corner of our block. He had lived there for longer than anyone could remember. He was retired, and he spent his days sitting on his porch, watching the neighborhood, knowing everything that happened, being greeted by people who had grown up in front of his house. He was the kind of elder who served as a kind of unofficial mayor of the block. He knew everyone's business, not in a nosy way, but in the way of someone who had earned the right to pay attention. That summer, I would sometimes sit on the steps near my house and watch Mr. Peterson on his porch. He would be there in the morning and he would be there in the afternoon. And sometimes he would still be there in the evening. He would nod at people who passed. Sometimes people would stop and talk with him. Sometimes he would call out a greeting. The way he moved seemed to have slowed significantly that summer, or perhaps he had simply grown older since the previous summer, and I was only now noticing it. I did not talk to him much, but I watched him, and I understood something from watching him, something about presence, about belonging, about the way a person could be a part of a place so thoroughly that the place was almost incomplete without them. I wonder now if he knew that the neighborhood was changing, if he understood that the world he had lived in was being dismantled. But if he knew, he did not show it. He simply continued his routine, sitting on the porch, being present, being part of the fabric of the place. By late July, I knew without being told that Mr. Peterson was ill. I could see it in the way he moved, or rather in the way he did not move. He stayed on the porch, but he seemed smaller. Sometimes I would see his daughter there with him, helping him, bringing him things. The porch that had been a gathering place became a place where people visited briefly, checking on him, paying their respects, even though he was still alive. The conversation about Mr. Peterson happened in fragments. I would overhear pieces of talk between grandmother and neighbors, or between my mother and grandmother, or between other adults. Nothing was said directly to me, and I did not ask questions, but I understood from the way people spoke, from the lowering of voices, from the particular kind of silence that followed certain statements, that Mr. Peterson was dying. The fact was not dramatized. It was not presented as something shocking or unexpected. It was simply a fact that was being managed, being grieved, being incorporated into the reality of the neighborhood. Michael did not seem to notice. Or perhaps he noticed and did not care in the way that children cannot care about things that do not directly affect them. He was occupied with his friends, with his games, with the simple pleasure of being outside during the day. But I noticed in a way that marked a division between who I had been and who I was becoming. I was becoming someone who could observe the larger patterns, someone who could understand that things were changing, someone who could grieve a little privately for something that was ending. That summer, I started a job. It was a small job helping the woman next door with her garden, doing weeding and watering and the simple labor that kept a garden alive. The pay was minimal and the work was not difficult, but it was work, real work that I had chosen and that I had agreed to do. I would work in the garden in the early morning or late afternoon when the heat was less intense. The woman, whose name was Mrs. Harris, would sometimes sit on her porch and watch me work, and sometimes she would work alongside me, showing me how to tell the difference between a plant and a weed, how to water so that the water went to the roots and not just soaked the surface. Mrs. Harris was younger than grandmother, but older than my mother, and she had a way of talking that made it seem like she was teaching me something important about life. Through the teaching of gardening, she would point out how each plant was different, how each one had particular needs. She would explain why we did things in certain ways. She did not condescend to me. She spoke to me as if I were capable of understanding, and I understood her, or at least I understood enough to do the work correctly. The money from the garden work was real money that I could keep. It was not much, but it was enough to buy things without asking, enough to feel a small sense of independence. I bought records, or went to the movies, or bought clothes that I had chosen myself. The money represented something beyond its monetary value. It represented the possibility of autonomy, the ability to shape some small part of my own life. But the work in the garden also kept me present in the neighborhood in a way that my friends who did not have jobs were not. While they were playing, I was working. While they were free, I was occupied. I was dividing my summer between freedom and responsibility in a way that they were not. This created a small space between me and my friends, a space that would only grow larger as time went on. By August, the heat had reached a kind of peak. The air was so heavy that even breathing felt like an activity that required thought. Everyone moved slowly. The neighborhood seemed to slow down. People stayed inside with their air conditioning or spent time on porches, gathering in small groups to talk and to be together without having to do much. It was during this time that Mr. Peterson died. The fact arrived gently into the neighborhood. I do not remember being told directly. I remember simply knowing, the way children know things through the pattern of behavior, through the sudden presence of flowers on his porch, through the quietness of his daughter, through the unusual number of people stopping by the house. There was a funeral. I did not go, but I understood that it was happening. I understood that the porch would be empty, that the old man would not be sitting there anymore watching the neighborhood. I understood that something permanent had changed, that the geography of the neighborhood had been altered by his absence. It was a small death in the context of the world, but it was a death that happened in my direct line of sight. And it changed something in me that I did not have the language to describe. The summer was ending now. Michael would go back home. I would go back to school. The summer that had seemed infinite had suddenly become finite. The days that had stretched out ahead of me at the beginning of June were now behind me. I was about to be a freshman in high school, which meant that I was entering a different world. The old neighborhood that I knew was about to become a place that I passed through, that I no longer lived in completely. As I think back on that summer now, I understand it as a kind of turning point. I understand it as the moment when I began to see the neighborhood, not just as the place where I live, but as a place that was alive and dying, that was being changed by forces I could not control, that was inhabited by people whose lives had depth and texture, and that would end. I understand it as the moment when I began to understand that I too would change, that I would outgrow things, that I would leave places and people behind. That loss was a part of living. But at the time, I simply lived it. I worked in the garden. I looked out for Michael. I felt the heat. I watched Mr. Peterson on his porch. I sat with my friends. I listened to music. I read books. I let the days pass. I did not know that this summer was teaching me something about time and change and impermanence. I did not know that this was one of the last summers where I would be a child in the fullest sense, where the world would still seem manageable, where the future would still seem open and undetermined. What remains is the sensation of it, the sound of the screen door, the heat in the air, the taste of lemonade, the sight of Mr. Peterson on his porch, the feel of earth under my fingernails from working in the garden, the particular quality of light at certain times of day. These things are not separate from what I learned that summer. They are what I learned. They are what carried the knowledge encoded in sensation and memory in a way that words could never quite capture.